The history of the State of Israel is fascinating. However, I find that most tourists in Israel don't visit many sites that are connected to this history. On a regular tour in Israel, you will visit Masada, Caesarea, the old city of Jerusalem, Banyas, Qumran, and many places around the Sea of Galilee. All of these sites have one thing in common: Second Temple, Second Temple, Second Temple. They are all connected to the time of the Second Temple. This is the time of Herod, Jesus, and the two Jewish rebellions against the Romans. In this video, and in many future videos, I will talk about modern Israel. Now, I plan to shoot this video in Rabin Center, which is, as far as I know, the only museum in Israel that focuses on Israeli history from 48 till today. But because of Corona, I changed the concept. So instead of walking through the Israeli Museum in the Rabin Center, I will recommend some other smaller sites. The first site I can recommend is the Hall of Independence in Tel Aviv, where David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, declared the State of Israel on the 14th of May, 48. The declaration was followed by Arab attacks. There are many battle sites connected to the War of Independence. Many of the well-known ones are on the way to Jerusalem and in Jerusalem Old City, but there are also a lot of sites in the Galilee and the Negev, as 7 Arab countries attacked Israel from all directions. The war ended in 49, and the biggest challenge during Israel's first years was the Aliyot, that is, the waves of immigrating Jews from Arab countries and Europe. Israel doubled its population from 650,000 to 1.3 million people in less than 2 years. The massive waves of immigration throughout the years from Arab countries and Europe in the 50s, and then from Russia and Ethiopia in the 90s, as well as many smaller ones in between, have brought enormous change to Israeli society, and with it, a lot of tension. The first time the tension erupted into violence was in 1959 in downtown Haifa, when Jews from North Africa protested against deprivation. There are many small sites that deal with the history of each diaspora community, but the best one is by far the Museum of the Jewish People in Bet Tfutzot, Tel Aviv University. At the beginning of the 50s, Israel was subjected to terrorist attacks, especially from Egypt, leading to a mini-war between Israel and Egypt in 1956. The British and the French were also involved. Now, the reason I mention the Suez Crisis is that it marks the shift of power in the region. Until then, the French and the British were the strongest forces in the region, and after the crisis, the US and the USSR made it clear that they were the new world police. Throughout the 50s, as in all other decades, there were some political dramas. In 1952, it was the reparations agreement between Israel and Germany. Ben-Gurion was the one who led the agreement, and there was resistance both from the left and from the right. One of the politicians who spoke against the agreement was Menachem Begin. Remember that name. Another huge drama was the Lavon affair, known in Hebrew as Esek Habish and Haparasha. The main issue was who gave the order to start a secret operation in Egypt that was later discovered. But the biggest drama, in my opinion, is the one no one talks about because it is taken for granted. Although most of the Jews came from poor, non-democratic countries, Israel stayed democratic from the beginning. There was never a military putsch or a dictatorship. The democratic foundations that were established before the founding of Israel and in its first years were and are still strong enough. Was Israeli democracy perfect? No. Ben-Gurion, who was prime minister for all but 2 years of the 50s, had too much power, and some of the Israeli Arabs lived under military control until the mid-60s. Now, I know some political anger will be directed at me for what I just said, but remember that I'm talking about the 50s. Your country wasn't perfect in the 50s either. Then, as today, Israeli Arabs enjoy more freedom and a higher standard of living than Arabs in any other Arabic country in the Middle East. The biggest event at the beginning of the 60s was the Eichmann trial. Every aspect of it was highly dramatic: how he was captured in Argentina, the trial itself, and his punishment. He was the only one to be executed in Israel. The trial changed the way Israelis think about the Holocaust. In 1963, Levi Eshkol became Israel's third prime minister, and Ben-Gurion retired to his house in Sde Boker, which is where I'm standing right now. His grave is 2 kilometers from here, overlooking the Tzin Valley. It's a popular stop on the way to the Ramon crater. Levi Eshkol was much more of an appeaser than Ben-Gurion, and it is perhaps for this reason that he is probably the most underestimated Israeli prime minister. This is something I will come back to in a minute. In 1964, the largest Israeli construction project came to fruition, Hamovil Artzi, the national water carrier bringing water from the Sea of Galilee to the Negev desert. The Six-Day War in 1967 was the most important event in the history of the State of Israel. It changed everything. If you take one thing from this video, take this. The Six-Day War in 1967 changed everything. I've already talked about all of this in a video about the history of Israel throughout songs, and I will leave a link up here and down below. So for now, I will focus on the sites. First of all, Jerusalem. Israel liberated the Old City, the Western Wall, and the holiest sites for Jews, the Temple Mount. Outside the Old City, the best-known battle site is Ammunition Hill. In the Golan Heights, the most visited site is Tel Facher. This tells us something interesting. The Israeli public remembers the tough battles during which something went wrong, and not the swift and successful ones. Another interesting thing is that the names the Israeli public remembers from the Six-Day War are Moshe Dayan, who was the Secretary of Defense, and Yitzhak Rabin, the Chief of Staff. The Prime Minister, Levi Eshkol, is not associated with the victory. Now, fast forward 6 years to the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and Prime Minister Golda Meir is very much associated with the failure. In the Golan Heights, there are many memorials for the soldiers that fought in the battles of Yom Kippur. Although Israel won, the war was Israel's biggest military failure and came as a huge shock to Israeli society. One of the aftershocks occurred 4 years after the war. In 1977, the Labour Party lost the election for the first time, and Menachem Begin, the right-wing leader, became prime minister. Now, before I talk about Begin's biggest achievement, I want to say something about one of Israel's best-known and successful military operations. As you all know, Israel suffered from terrorist attack. In 1976, 2 Arabs and 2 German terrorists kidnapped an Air France plane and landed it in Uganda. The Germans, by the way, were from the left. I find it interesting. One day I will make a video about the long, strange, weird connection between the extreme left and the Arab world. And just so you know, it was the German terrorists who separated the Jews from the non-Jews. The crew of the plane, led by pilot Michel Bakou, demanded to stay with the Jews. The non-Jews were released, and the Jews and the crew were held as hostages. An elite Israeli army unit led by Yoni Netanyahu, the brother of Benjamin Netanyahu, flew there and freed the Israeli hostages in a brave, almost unreal operation. Yoni Netanyahu was the only Israeli soldier that was killed. He is buried in Har Herzl, Mount Herzl, Israel National Cemetery, and its largest military graveyard. 2 years in office, and Begin signed a peace treaty with the country that has been Israel's greatest enemy for 30 years, Egypt. I find it interesting that when the left was in power during the Six-Day War, Israel liberated Jerusalem and expanded, and when the right was in power, Begin gave away Sinai. Only the left can lead a war, and only the right can make peace. remember that the next time you vote. Always vote for the candidate from the other party. During the 80s, Israel society was divided because of the Lebanon War, which began in 82. A year later, in 83, Begin resigned from office, and afterwards came a grand coalition with Shimon Peres from the left and Yitzhak Shamir from the right. There was nothing grand about this coalition. In the middle of the 80s, there was a huge economic crisis as Israel moved from socialism towards a market economy. In 87, the first Intifada started and lasted until the Oslo Agreement of 93. In 95, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a Jew. It occurred at the end of a peace demonstration in Tel Aviv, and a memorial stands on the spot where he was murdered. This was experienced as a huge trauma in Israeli society. We never believed it could happen to us. This also touches a very sensitive nerve in the Jewish DNA. The two ancient Jewish kingdoms, the first and second temple, were not destroyed because of outside forces, but because of an inner conflict. But maybe I'm being here a bit too dramatic. Israeli history and life in Israel is not all about terror and wars. In the 90s, the high-tech scene took off. Israel is, I think, the second only to the US when it comes to startup companies. In the year 2000, when I was enlisted in the army, the second Intifada started and lasted for 5 years. In 2005, under Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, whose entire life stood on the right side of the political spectrum, conducted the evacuation of all Jewish settlements from the Gaza Strip. But although there isn't a single Israeli in Gaza, Hamas kept on firing rockets on Israeli cities and conducting other terrorist attacks. And that led to some military operations. The biggest one was in 2014, Tzuk Eitan. In 2009, Benjamin Netanyahu replaced Ehud Olmert as prime minister. Ehud Olmert has the great honor of being the first Israeli prime minister to go to jail because of corruption. From 2009 till today, Netanyahu has been prime minister. In 2011, there was a large-scale cost of living protest in Israel, which I talked about in the last video I made. In 2020, 26 years after the last peace treaty was signed with Jordan in 1994, Israel signed a peace treaty with Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. So this video ends on a positive note. I, along with all Israelis, I imagine, hope that other Arab countries will follow suit. Now, you might have heard about something else that happened in Israel in 2020, and that is the spreading of a virus. One of the industries that has been hardest hit is the tourism industry. I haven't guided for almost a year. If you want to support me, you can purchase my great booklets and other merch. Look what Corona has done to me. I've gone from being a respectable tour guide to selling t-shirts and towels, but just look how beautiful they are. Huh? That's it. All links will be down below. See you in the next video. Yalla bye.